What these National Party guys do, these Afrikaner nationalists, they're opposed to it for two reasons. One, they say, the segregation model it's the importation of large numbers of blacks and then segregating them. And they call that a kind of caste society, which it was. And they say, this is unsustainable. This is unsustainable because you're using black labor on a mass scale, but you're not giving them any political rights or indeed even any social rights. That's unsustainable because they're going to get damned angry and you're creating a revolution here, particularly if you're bringing large numbers of them in because we're going to get swamped by them. So they were deeply worried that they said the country would be swamped by black people. So you're going to bring lots and lots of black people, millions of black people in. It's the same argument you hear in Europe now when they say, why are we bringing all these migrants in? We will eventually become a minority and be replaced. That's what they were saying.
That was their concern.
So they were saying, we will be replaced. The white society we've built in South Africa will be replaced by a black society. But worse than that, they said what the British were doing was semi-westernizing them. So you weren't even westernizing them. You weren't turning them.
Hello guys, hope you're doing good. I want to welcome you back. And today we are going to talk about South Africa. As the video that I did last, today we are going to talk about the apartheid rule. How did the apartheid rule came to be in South Africa, and what were the procedures, and how did the people who are convicted to this rule find it easy or hard for themselves? So as always, I have a video that we will be watching, and this video will tell us more about how the apartheid rule was being done in South Africa and many things that were being done, the effects and the advantages. Oh, obvious, there were no advantages. The effects that happened in South Africa. So before I talk more, let's dive into the video, and then we will come back and talk more about the video. So yeah, let's dive in.
I have to confess, I haven't studied South African politics or history very, very closely. So I have largely the popular view, maybe slightly different, popular view of South Africa, which was the apartheid was a system of segregation, of exploitation of the blacks, of denying them the vote, of cruelty, and of insult and loss of dignity. I know we're going to discuss that in some detail. Could you define for me what actually was the original goal? You were telling me, for example, that apartheid was actually conceptualized back in the 1930s.
Yeah.
What was the original goal, and how did it fall short?
Okay, well, as I say, the original concept was, in fact, formulated back in the 1930s and then developed slightly further in the 40s. Okay, now what was that? It was a response to the Boer War, which most people don't realize. So it was an internal struggle between Afrikaners and English-speaking South Africans. It wasn't about black people.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, black people were not part of the political process in South Africa, and so you didn't have to consider them, and that wasn't the struggle. Okay, so the struggle was the Boer War impoverished many Afrikaners because they were driven off the land. Their farms were burnt, their towns were burnt. They were put in concentration camps. 20% of the population died in concentration camps. It was devastating. I mean, the place was a wreck afterwards. It was like Germany after the Second World War was a wreck. Now these farmers, because they were farmers, it was a farming community, they were driven off the land. Okay? And the British then come in and they create a new state called the Union of South Africa. South Africa is a British invention. The country, the boundaries are drawn by the British. They create a new country, a new political dispensation, which is the Westminster system. But they also build a new economy, and the new economy is the one based upon gold mining. So it's the one you think of, and it was indeed. There was a lot of exploitation because it was based upon the British model was invented by Cecil Rhodes, the economic model, and the model was to import black tribesmen in huge numbers to the country to work on the mines for very little, doing unskilled labor. So Rhodes worked out a system of how you could take people with no skills but turn them into economic productive units, if you like. Mm-hmm. That was brilliant. And it created the economy that South Africa had, which was this deep-level mining industry. Okay, but now these Afrikaners that had been driven off the land were impoverished, and they lived in squatter camps. They lived in the images you see of shacklands in Rio de Janeiro. It was like that. They were living in absolute poverty. And these were mixed-race slums. So Afrikaners were living with black people in mixed-race slums and intermarrying with them, which horrified the Afrikaans middle class, as you can well imagine. The people that invented apartheid were people like Verwoerd, for example, and they were professors of social work. They were working with these people, with these poor people, and they went, this can't carry on. We have to do something to stop this. How do we stop this poverty? And they blamed the British, and they blamed the British system, and they blamed the British economy. And they said, this has to end. So that is the birth of Afrikaner nationalism. Okay. And apartheid was a response to how they thought the country was going to develop in the future. So they looked at the model that the British Empire had put into place, which was this deep-level mining using cheap black labor that you import in mass. Like, it's a little bit like importing labor into Europe now when they say we haven't got enough people to work. So we're just going to import the third world. That's what they were doing. They were importing the third world into South Africa.
And were they socializing with them?
No, because the British the British system is one of segregation. Now, segregation is where you create one economy, where you all work together in the same economy, but you don't live in the same society. So you work together during the day in the same economy, but at night you go back to your separate areas.
So hold on a moment. This is my first surprise moment.
Yeah.
You're telling me that the originators, the people who conceived of apartheid, were opposed to segregation?
Absolutely.
Explain that for me.
Okay, so what these National Party guys do, these Afrikaner nationalists, they're opposed to it for two reasons. One, they say, the segregation model it's the importation of large numbers of blacks and then segregating them. And they call that a kind of caste society, which it was. And they say, this is unsustainable. This is unsustainable because you're using black labor on a mass scale, but you're not giving them any political rights or indeed even any social rights. That's unsustainable because they're going to get damned angry and you're creating a revolution here, particularly if you're bringing large numbers of them in because we're going to get swamped by them. So they were deeply worried that they said the country would be swamped by black people. So you're going to bring lots and lots of black people, millions of black people in. It's the same argument you hear in Europe now when they say, why are we bringing all these migrants in? We will eventually become a minority and be replaced. That's what they were saying.
That was their concern.
So they were saying, we will be replaced. The white society we've built in South Africa will be replaced by a black society. But worse than that, they said what the British were doing was semi-westernizing them. So you weren't even westernizing. You weren't turning them into black Western people. You were turning them into black semi-Western people because they were tribesmen who went back to their original homelands. You kept their wives back there and their children back there. So you were only semi-westernizing them. And they said eventually the country will be filled with millions and millions of semi-westernized black people who will become the demographic majority. And at a certain point, they will say, this is our country. And then what? And of course, what they said because their argument was against British business. What they were called the landlords. These rich guys, okay? Now, the landlords needed two kinds of labor for the mines. One, they needed these cheap black guys that were unskilled. Okay, and they just dug holes, basically.
And they wanted them to remain unskilled.
Of course they did. Of course, no, absolutely no. You don't want them to be anything else except that. That's work. The model's working. Why would you? In fact, you couldn't run this. You couldn't run South African gold mining if you had to pay proper wages. It would be unsustainable. So you had to keep them like that indefinitely, which is of course what the national body said. You're not going to get away with this indefinitely. You might think you will, but at some point they're going to get really angry with you. But the other type of labor they needed was the skilled artisans. You did need skilled people as well. And what the miners were doing is they were bringing British migrants in, skilled British artisans. So they were bringing in British artisans and black labor from the tribal areas and flooding the country with these people. And Afrikaners are going, hey, this used to be my country. What are you doing? That was the objection. And they were saying, segregation is not going to work. So what do we have to do? And they said, well, we don't want this British-made state. They said, you have created a state which throws people together who do not belong together. That was the basic argument. You're throwing people together who do not belong together. We don't want the state that you built. Because you're making us a minority in what was our own country.
Notice that I'm struck by the role of ethnicity versus race in this.
It's not about race.
It's about ethnicity.
Absolutely.
Which overlaps with
Absolutely.
race.
It's about ethnicity.
But they were resentful about the English migrants being brought
Absolutely.
in as well.
They were very concerned about the English migrants.
That was also marginalising them as well.
Well, in fact, the person who built the system was a person called Lord Alfred Milner. He was the Governor General at the time who ran the system. And he had a deliberate policy of anglicizing the white people. So he said, we'll end up with lots of cheap black labor and one white race. Afrikaners were to be anglicized. So, for example, one of the things he did is he forbade the speaking of Afrikaans at the schools. They were forced to speak English and were beaten. So if a brother and a sister were caught speaking Afrikaans to each other at school, they were beaten for doing so. So you can imagine how that generated nationalism immediately.
Exactly.
Now, what then happened is, and this is one of the curious things about apartheid, is that the people that stepped into the breach was the Dutch Reformed Church. Because it was, in fact, the only Afrikaans institution that was not destroyed by the Boer War. So the Dutch Reformed Church is still in place. And the Dutch Reformed Church set up their own schools in Afrikaans. They were illegal. They were illegal schools, but they ran them anyway. And Afrikaans parents would send their kids to these schools. Now, this is interesting because they called them, these church schools were called Christian national schools. And the people who credit apartheid, their own word for apartheid was not apartheid. It was Christian nationalism. They always called themselves Christian nationalists. And they called their education system Christian national education, which came from those schools. So it's all part of the story. And the very first thing they did when they took over the country in 1948 was to create Christian national schools and to forbade Afrikaners from sending their kids to English-speaking schools.
Interesting.
Because they wanted them, it was about English. The initial target
culture again.
It was about culture. It was like, we don't want our children to be English. We don't want to be assimilated into your single Anglo world. We want to be our own people.
Now, there's an element of that critique of those early theoreticians that I just want to clarify.
Yeah.
And you already touched on it, it concerns the development, the economic and cultural development of the black, low income earners. That was built in. That was an integral part of the British capitalist model, was keep them undeveloped.
Yes.
To keep wages
In
down.
fact, that is white supremacy.
And powerless.
That is white supremacy.
It's a form of white supremacy. How actually did the originators of apartheid deal with that? What was their position?
Right, so the original theorists in the 1930s, in fact, say this is white supremacy, which is unsustainable. Because they're saying, what you are doing is you want to put all of us whites on top and keep us there forever and keep blacks under us. So they call it horizontal differentiation.
Like a caste system.
Basically. So they're saying, whites here, blacks there, horizontally, they're oppressed forever. They're not going to tolerate that. So they said, what we want to do is to separate people vertically, not horizontally.
By territory.
Exactly. So the model of apartheid was, they said, okay, what we're going to do is we do not accept your state. The South African state, we want to break up your state. So we're going to take over the state. Their objective was to take over the state, not to run the entire state, but to break it up. To break up the British-made state
countries,
into separate ethnic countries.
Yeah.
So they look at this, and they were anthropologists that did this. So their main theoretician was a person called Werner Aiselin, who had grown up on a mission station, spoke multiple black languages, but he became an anthropologist. So he looked at this and he said, in South Africa, I can identify 9 separate, Westerners would call them tribes. The National Party stopped calling them tribes and said, no, they're nations. A Zulu, you have a right to you're a Zulu nation, just as much as a Frenchman has got a nation or an Englishman has a nation. Zulu should have their nation too. So their objective was they were going to divide South Africa up into these separate nations. Each black tribe or nation would be given its own national state. And then every black person would become a citizen of one of those states. The idea is you would develop them into proper states. They would eventually become independent. And when they were independent, if black people were citizens of that state, they would cease to be the citizens of South Africa. And eventually there would be no black people left as citizens of South Africa, but all black people would have the vote.
So that was the goal.
That was the model.
The vision.
Yeah.
Vision of it.
Yeah.
And I must comment there, just to take us
Now
back.
that's apartheid, which is full partition, not segregation.
Yeah,
that's the difference.
And
that's the vision.
And it's a vision. So we've got apartheid being very different to segregation. Already that's my first surprise. And the second surprise is apartheid allowed for full development of the potential of all peoples, black homelands, white homelands, British and Dutch.
That's right. So in fact, the theorists actually said what the theorists said was, because they were Christian nationalists, and the one thing you have to understand about Afrikaner nationalists is they are intensely Christian. I mean, it is fundamental to Afrikaner culture that the church is central to your culture. Okay, and because of that, they're Christian. They kind of go, it matters to them. They're going, it's not very nice to suppress black people. And they said that to the British. This is not very nice, you know. I mean, like, why are you doing this? This is awful what you're doing. Because in fact, they said, you're oppressing black people and us as Afrikaners. We understand how they feel because you're doing the same thing to us. And we think this is not terribly crash hot. So in fact, what we want to do is we want to liberate them as we want to liberate ourselves. What we want for ourselves is our own state. And our own ethnicity is preserved in that state.
No.
And we want to give that to Zulus and Xhosa and all these other guys. Well, we want to give to them what we want to give to ourselves.
So as we said in our last video, the people who were in South Africa, the first people who lived in South Africa were the Khoisan community. They were the people who lived in South Africa, and then came the Dutch people. So the Dutch people occupied the lower part of South Africa, which is the recent Cape Town. So when the British came, the Dutch people were mainly farmers. Of course, the Khoisan were hunters and gatherers, but the Dutch people were mainly farmers. They practiced farming. So when the British came, they came and looked at the country and knew that this country had gold. So as time went on, the British came with the black people to help them in their mining places. So they brought more and more and more black people. So when this came, obvious, the British people were superior to the Dutch, who are now called the Afrikaners. So this made it hard for the Afrikaners to compete with the British people. The British people brought more and more black people to work in the mining fields. So as time went on, some were coming some were coming to their mining fields and then going back to their wives and children where they were from, because they were not taken by force. They came as people who were being paid. So they came and worked and then went back home. They came, worked, and then went back home. It reached a point that there was no need of them going back, so they started living in South Africa. So when they lived in South Africa, they started living in slums with these Afrikaners. So there was mixed race slums. So the higher class, the upper class Dutch people, the Afrikaners who were at a upper class, so that this was not a good thing. So the people that worked in the mines decided that this was not a good thing. They said that they cannot continue with this poverty because both the Afrikaners and the black people were in big poverty within the areas because they were being paid low wages. The British hired both the Afrikaners and the black people, and they were being paid low wages. Low wages. So they decided that this won't go on. So they came up with the idea of the apartheid. They went on and made a treaty with the British people. Of course, they were being segregated. They decided that people will be living in different places. The whites will be living, the British people will be living on their side, the Dutch people who are the Afrikaners will be living on their side, and the black people will be living on their side. It was like three different communities. It was like three different communities. It reached a limit that even schools, the British people didn't want the Dutch people, the Afrikaners, to speak their own languages. They were being told to speak English, and being that the Dutch people had already gotten used to their community, they didn't want this. So the only place where the British people did not make their role was on their churches. So the Dutch people had their churches. So some African people, the black people, decided to take their children to Dutch schools who mainly was at these churches. It was like illegal schools because the British people only allowed British schools where they taught English only. Well, the Afrikaners did not see this as a good idea. So they decided to open their own schools in the Dutch churches where the British rule had no power in the Dutch churches. So some black people took their children to the churches where they received education, yeah, in these illegal schools. But these Afrikaners went to these British schools where they couldn't even speak. They couldn't even speak. They couldn't even speak their own languages. Yeah, poverty was a really big thing in South Africa. Even right now, if you speak, there are some Africans who are living in slums. You can't believe that these are white people in South Africa living in such kind of state. They are like really, really poor right now, even right now. You can't believe that these are white people living like they are nationalists of South Africa, like they are citizens of South Africa. They have no other place that they can call home, that they can say that we will go back to Europe or America or something. South Africa is their home, that is their place, and there's nowhere they can go. So the apartheid really affected South Africa until it reached a point the black people decided this apartheid won't go on. You can't come to our own country. You can't come to our own country and control us the way you want. And we are working at your minefields, and you are not paying us as the way it should be. You are paying us low wages that even can't help us with our family. Can't you are even refusing to take us to put our children into the system of education. That wasn't a good thing. So it reached a point the black people decided that what's wrong, it will be wrong. It will even if it is through blood, we will fight for our own rights. And the British people, the black people managed to kick the British people out of South Africa. And now South Africa is a beautiful country. Thanks to the British people, South Africa has really developed. Yeah, there's an advantage that the British people brought to the nation of South Africa. They are the one who knew that this country had gold. So thanks to them, South Africa is so developed. It has so many beautiful cities. Yeah, and that comes to the end of our video today. See you next time. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and share, and even drop a comment if you've liked the video. Bye.